And we've just gone live with a very special guest tonight, an author and an expert in Russian and communist military and foreign policy, Jeff Nyquist. He's quite prolific. He has several books on Amazon, and we're going to talk about them tonight. But I think I want all of you to go over to his YouTube to get to know Jeff, where you can get linked to other things. He also has a very important blog, and that's at
jrnyquist.blog.
Pleasure to have you on, Jeff. How the heck are you?
Thanks for having me on the Oppenheimer Ranch project.
So tonight, what I want to do, because you're an expert in Russian and foreign affairs and military, I just want to pick your brain about what's going on in the Ukraine with Russia. Now, before you give us your expert opinion, it's very clear to the American people that we have our own border issues here, which are being ignored, and we are making top priority for the American people the security at the Ukrainian border, and very few people get it. So, can you, in layman's terms, break it down? What the heck is going on over there?
Well, right now, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union in 1991. It separated from the Soviet Union, and it was the most important Soviet republic outside of the Russian Republic. The communist structures in all the republics remained, dominant in media, in business, in politics, and the Soviet Union just didn't collapse. It's just like the Nazis, there was no denazification. There was no Nuremberg trial for the communists. They ended up, dominating all the institutions in the post-Soviet world. And so the Ukrainian people got exasperated because there was lack of reform. So they had a number of revolutions, the Orange Revolution, the Maidan Revolution. There was others besides that. But each time they would not get their leaders to really change for freedom. Here in 2014, though, the popular revolution against the Viktor Yanukovych government was Yanukovych fled to Russia because he got afraid of the mob of angry citizens, and Russia denounced it. Russia intervened. Russia seized Crimea, declared it a part of Russia, and then there were revolts in the two eastern provinces, or oblasts is what they call them, of Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk, or Lugansk as the Russians say, and they declared themselves independent republics. They're run by communists, and there was like a civil war started there in 2014, and largely they're Russian volunteer troops fighting under rebel flags there. It's been going on for, the last 7+ years, almost 8 years. Now what's happened is,
Jeff, are these quote unquote independent provinces? Are they part of Ukraine? And they're
breakaway provinces that have declared their independence from Ukraine, from Kiev government.
Yeah, and they're on the border with Russia currently?
Right. They're on the eastern, they're the two most eastern provinces. They're along the Don River,
okay.
Or well, not quite. They're almost over there. They're right on the eastern, Ukraine's eastern border with Russia. Donetsk is at the south along the Sea of Azov, and Luhansk is just north of it. What's happened now is they had a peace process called the Minsk agreement, something or other, peace agreement process. It is broken down because the Russians are claiming that Ukraine was not following it. Ukraine's claiming that Russia's wasn't following it. And what has happened now is that the Duma last week voted on a bill to recognize Lugansk and Donetsk as independent countries. And today, Putin, meeting with his government, decided to officially recognize them. Yeah. And now the Russians are sending their army into those provinces, where the Ukrainian army is fighting the rebels. And there's been exchanges of artillery fire for the last several days there in Luhansk and especially Donetsk. And so it looks like war in earnest, because the Russians now are invading Ukrainian territory outright, because Luhansk and Donetsk are recognized by international law and also by the the Budapest Memorandum, which Russia, Britain, and the United States signed in, I think it was 1994, when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. Russia signed an agreement saying we will recognize the current borders of Ukraine
Mhm.
if they give up their nuclear weapons. And Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, said, well, that treaty just says we won't attack them with nuclear weapons, not that we won't attack them with conventional weapons. So, but that's not really the way it reads. It says that they would respect Ukraine as a sovereign country.
Now, these breakaway territories are obviously, now this is just my perspective, and tell me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
It's like the other countries are defining what's going on in these countries, not the countries themselves. So a breakaway province, isn't it the people in that province that make the decision if they're part of Russia or Ukraine, not foreign governments and foreign entities?
I think that if you ask the people of Luhansk and Donetsk what country they would, and this is just my impression, you're
Yeah.
going to have Russians that are going to violently deny this. But from talking to people on both sides, it's my impression that the people of Donetsk and Luhansk want to be Ukrainians. They
Okay.
don't want to live in Russia. It's a little nicer. You have more freedom in Ukraine than in Russia. And they don't really want to be. But there are people there who want to be part of Russia and are fanatical. And the evidence is that they can't, those breakaway rebels, they can't find enough troops from the native population willing to fight for their independence.
Yeah.
They have to smuggle Russians,
Mm-hmm.
soldiers who volunteer to go over to those provinces and pretend to be, part of the citizenry trying to get their freedom. So it's a pretty much a scam.
Yeah,
On the
but
part of
one other
Russia.
thing that's a scam is that the US is claiming that the Ukraine is a democracy. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about how undemocratic the Ukraine actually is?
Well, you want to be careful not to say the Ukraine,
Or
because that means
Ukraine?
you're
Yeah,
pro-Russian. If you
yeah.
say the Ukraine, if you say
Sorry.
Ukraine, then your Ukrainians listeners are going to be very unhappy with you.
Let's look. I'm Ukrainian, so on my mother's side, so I'm half
Mhm.
Ukrainian. So yeah.
Look, this is a very complicated question. You got a lot of simple narratives going on um, with this whole thing. The simple narrative is, let's go right to it. The simple narrative is NATO promised that it would not move east at the end of the Cold War, not 1 inch, right? The
Mhm.
Russians, I've heard Putin say this, but it's an absolute lie. There's no such promise. I challenge you to find a treaty or an official agreement or even a presidential executive agreement or agreement by NATO with such a promise in it. You go and read the official histories. You read the scholarly accounts. There is no such treaty.
Mm.
We never made that an agreement. Now, here's where people think we did. This is how they construe things. James Baker, I think it was in 1990, made the proposal that we would offer not to move NATO east if they made unification of Germany an easier proposition. The Russians did not respond because the Russians wanted to unify Germany because they thought Germany unified would become left wing, would drop out of NATO and sign a separate defense agreement with Russia. So they didn't care. The Russians were playing a game of their own in 1990, and that game backfired. It didn't turn out the way they wanted. Now, if they'd known how it was going to turn out, they would have asked for those guarantees, but they didn't. And in fact, it's worse. Even in 1990, if you go back and look, Poland and Hungary were asking, just as the Warsaw Pact was breaking up, that was the Soviet alliance in Eastern Europe that included Poland, Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia at the time, East Germany, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. That was, and of course, the Soviet Union. That was the Warsaw Pact. It was a big military alliance, armed to the teeth, ready to invade Western Europe, and they outgunned us. To be honest, they had more troops, more tanks, more missiles, everything. But we were armed too, and it was a nuclear standoff as well. So what happened at the time was Hungary, as Warsaw Pact was breaking up in 1990, after the 1989, Ceausescu fell, the Berlin Wall came down, you had Solidarity coming to power in Poland. And so Poland and Hungary said, we want to belong to NATO. Soviet Union, Gorbachev didn't say, you can't, we won't allow it, we'll send troops. No. And in fact, the agreement on the unification of Germany that was ultimately signed by the Soviet Union, and people can look this up, and this is where NATO started moving east. There were Soviet armies in East Germany. They said, all right, The United Germany is going to become a NATO country. They recognize that. That means, but we won't allow NATO troops in East Germany until all the Soviet troops are gone. And that took a few years.
Mhm.
But that wasn't, and then there were agreements about transiting NATO supplies to Poland, which implied Poland would become a NATO country. No objection from Moscow. So then Gorbachev asked James Baker, the US Secretary of State, can the Soviet Union join NATO? You talk about NATO moving east. That was what they wanted. So now they're complaining that NATO moved east and they facilitated it. They didn't say anything. And now you got to ask, why did they facilitate it? Because if you read the defector literature, if you read what their strategy was, the Soviet Union wanted to reconfigure itself so it could get Western technology, it could modernize its economy and its military, which they've done. But in order to do it, they had to reform their system. And that was a bumpy road for them. And they would have to leave Eastern Europe and do all these. Those were the concessions they got for money. I mean, Germany gave them billions and billions, and we gave them credits. And they got food and all kinds of other support, but they got trade. They got technology, all the things they needed, by the way, to build fifth generation weapons, which they have and we don't, to build new road mobile ICBMs and a modern ABM system that beats anything that we have. That's what they've done with all the money, all the technology they got from us.
Yeah, they got a whole fleet of nuclear icebreakers that they just put online.
Yeah. So the thing is that they want NATO now to move back out. Why? Because now they have all the weapons to push us out. Because we gave them the technology. We trusted them. So it isn't us who cheated them. They cheated us. Look, they cheated on the IMF agreement. You can look it up. That's the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Agreement. Everybody knows they cheated. Even the Obama administration admitted they cheated, although they didn't know what they were going to do about it. They cheated on the ABM agreement, which of course has been abrogated since Bush. They cheated on the Conventional Forces in Europe agreement, and they used the war in Chechnya as an excuse for cheating on that one. So their conventional forces they didn't draw down. They'd promised to get rid of their tactical nuclear weapons. They put them in storage, and now they brought them out of storage. They have 20,000 tactical nuclear weapons. What do we have? 100 in the UK now? 100 tactical nuclear weapons to 20,000. It's not fair. And then they've developed thermobaric bombs and hypersonic missiles. We don't have any of that. And now they're coming back online as an enemy saying, you got to demilitarize Eastern and Central Europe, and we're taking back Ukraine into the Union. And by Putin's statement today, which is saying that separation, the breakup of the Soviet Union was illegal, that implies that Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, that are NATO countries now, are still in the Soviet Union and need to be returned to the Soviet Union, right? Or a new union that's going to take the place of it.
Right. So with Russia getting so close to China and with these military maneuvers happening, it's basically war games are on. What is the end game? I mean, is the end game for Russia and China to become a superpower and take over the world?
Basically.
And we have a
Look, let me tell you what the defector literature said.
Yeah.
There was a guy named Anatoly Golitsyn. You can look it up. He wrote a book called New Lies for Old in 1984. He was in a planning group. He was in a think tank, a KGB think tank in Moscow in the late 50s. And when Sputnik happened and when the hydrogen bomb was developed, they redid their strategy, the Soviet Union. And it was under a committee led by Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev wasn't the head of the country yet. It was still Khrushchev. And it was Marshal Sokolovsky and a KGB general named Nikolai Mironov. And they thought of this strategy where the KGB would do a deception strategy and a fake liberalization and democratization of communism. And meanwhile, they would build up the rockets and the military for a smash up war. So they were going to do both things. They were going to go for deception and peace and reform and more military to win. And that was it was like two legs. Your right leg and your left leg are opposite, but they each walk together to help you walk, right? So that's dialectics. That's their dialectical way of advancing their strategy. That was back in the late 50s. They officially adopted that strategy in 1960. Now, what Golitsyn said this means is, he said in 1984, the Soviet Union is going to fake its liberalization. He said the Berlin Wall is going to go down, probably. Soviet Union is going to reform. They're going to have separation of powers. The Communist Party is going to give up its monopoly of power in the Soviet Union. Now, Golitsyn wrote this in 1984. And he said that a new liberal Soviet leader was going to emerge. He wrote that a year before Gorbachev came to power. Now, how did he know? Because he knew what their general strategy was, and he was following events there closely. And he was a good intelligence analyst, and he was working with some CIA people who are good analysts, and they kind of figured it out. And that's what's in his book. Now, there's another defector named Jan Shana who said, yes, I was told about a plan. They were going to fake the collapse of the Warsaw Pact. Shana's book came out in 1982. It was called We Will Bury You. You can look that up too. Jan Shana was one of the highest level Czech defectors. He was like the Czech defense commissar, the guy who watched the defense ministry for the Communist Party. He was like a protege of Khrushchev. So these, and then there's Zadoslav Bittman also made allusions to it about this deception. He worked for the head of Soviet disinformation general as a Czech head of Czech disinformation. So he knew about this. These guys knew about the strategy. These defectors who knew about the strategy. Now, what's really interesting is that these things. It was in his book Wedge, and now the author's name. There was an analysis done of Golitsyn's 140 falsifiable predictions he made in '84. By 1994, almost 94% of his predictions had come true about the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Eastern Bloc. And it was a deceptive collapse because we know Putin's KGB. Yeah. The old communist structures are still in control in the Russian Federation. But Golitsyn made a very interesting prediction that he didn't get credit for in '94 because it's only coming true now. And he said at the end of the long-range strategy, when they come back with this big military power while the West has been sleeping, believing that Russia's changed and working with China doing the same thing, Russia and China would unite into one clenched fist. And they would unite, and there would be such a change in the balance of power, the West would basically be compelled to retreat and surrender sequentially to Russian and Chinese moves. And he wrote this in 1984. Wow. And again, it's coming true. So he's not just 94% correct. It's like 95, 96%.
All right. So draw it out for us. What happens over the next year? They take over Ukraine. Yes.
They're basically what they're doing is they're putting together the old Soviet Union because they need those structures to be openly, overtly connected. They need, if you've been telling somebody, oh, I'm weak, I'm crippled, I can't do anything. And then all of a sudden stick them up and you go, oh no, you're just joking. You're weak and crippled. You can't beat us. Well, now they have to kind of educate us in the fact that they're stronger than we are and we have to give in or else. So there's these steps that are being taken. China's got a navy bigger than us. They're demonstrating their new hypersonic missiles. They're testing them. The Russia just had a nuclear war exercise on Saturday, showing what they could do. And the exercise, I understand, was very successful. China's been doing the same thing. North Korea, they've got their EMP weapons. And they're trying to attack the dollar at the same time. And then there's this pandemic where it came out of China and it hit us and it's hurt our economies. And they've also used all these years of our lack of vigilance. It's like, oh, there's no communism. We don't need to worry about communists. Well, who do you think Obama was? Who do you think his friends were? Is Boris Johnson, who's discovered his Borisness, his Russianness? I mean, the conservatives in Europe are pro-Putin, many of them. You've got people like Patrick Buchanan, a conservative who likes Putin. You've got people still in love with Mao in the West, leftists, and in love with Castro, in love with Trudeau, right? If Trudeau is Castro's secret son, right?
There are teachers in the U.S. that have pictures of these communists hanging in the classroom. We live in a dystopian world, Jeff.
Yeah, no, communism, when people said communism is dead, what were all these communist mobs running around in the United States, pulling down statues of George Washington, Ulysses S. Grant, Teddy Roosevelt? Right?
Exactly. Now, right? I'm right there with you. So what will happen is there's going to be that clenched fist you saw is already happening.
Yes.
And they're going to start to put pressure militarily on these things.
Yes.
And we are going to fight back with by cutting them off with the money funding.
Well,
And
this
that would
is
just
like
make
a
them
stick
more
up.
angry, right?
Right. Imagine a stick up. I got my gun on you. Okay, stick them up. And you go, oh, I'm going to cut your bank account. I'm going to cut your credits. I'm going to cut off your credit card. You can't stick me up. See, that's
Yeah.
what we think we're going to do, economic sanctions on Russia. So this is what I got. This is information from Russia. It's not really super secret information because the Russians have been sharing it with select friends that have been carrying it out to the West. So here's the story. The Russians have said, I heard this almost 2 weeks ago, we're going to invade Ukraine. And if you put economic sanctions on us, we're going to do a massive cyber attack on the East Coast and shut down New York and Washington. And if
Awesome.
you want more, we'll give you more.
Yeah.
Right. So by the way, Biden responded to that on Thursday. If you watched Biden's little statement that he made and didn't answer any questions from the press, Biden said, if the Russians cyber attack us, we will cyber attack them right back. So both sides are threatening escalation. And the question is, which side has the muscle? Who's serious? I think the Russians are going to attempt to demonstrate our weakness. I think that's what they're up to.
Now, Jeff, I thought we had alien technology at Area 51.
Very good. Yeah, these are good, interesting questions. Are we deceiving the world, trying to make them think we've got alien technology, or do we really have something? And I recall a conversation. I was speaking in New Mexico, and a physicist was there, and he wanted to talk to me afterwards. I still have the silver dollar he gave me as a token of his appreciation. And he said to me, he said, he didn't know for sure, but he thought the whole alien story was a cover for technologies that he had actually worked on, and he thought that we were developing. That was his thought. He wasn't 100% sure, but that was his impression. There is also, I've written about this. You've probably seen on my website. I've written about UFOs and the occult. It's a very complicated subject, and I think a lot of the conspiracy theory people, they shortchange it by going into these. It's very, it's a shortcut, and it may be oversimplifying to do some of the things they do. Because I'll give you an example. People talk about a Masonic conspiracy, and they talk about secret societies tracing back to ancient Babylonian Egypt, right? In the Greek mystery religions. And what are these secrets? Hermeticism, the Sumerian black magic that you find out when they dug up Azurbanipal's library, and they found all these black magic texts, like summoning the 7 wicked spirits to attack your enemies. I mean, try reading that text. I think it was translated in the 1840s, and you can't get through it. It's too terrifying. I mean, it really gives you the willies to read this stuff. I mean, it's literally a ritual where you're saying this poetry over and over again, summoning these 7 wicked spirits over and over. And it goes on for like 28 minutes if you actually time it out. And you know what was across the street from Azurbanipal's library and the ruins that they found? The House of Exorcisms. Right?
Yeah. Why not?
It's like, oh, they get into trouble there playing with this stuff, and they have to run over to the House of Exorcisms. So the Babylonian magic, look, you don't want to sneer at the occult. There's something real there. And look, when I was in the UC Irvine, I went to graduate school at UC Irvine. I used to have lunch with a parapsychologist there I fell in with. I was a psychology minor. I was interested in psychology. He did the test on Uri Geller, the Israeli psychic. He was one of the people, I think at Stanford, that ran the first test. And he told me stories that would curl your hair about what Geller could do, that they couldn't even put in a real test. His specialty was designing tests. So this stuff is not, I'm quite convinced, talking to some of the scientists that have worked on this. And you could read Annie Jacobs' book, Phenomena. She talks about Geller. So I read the book, but I had a personal contact with one of these scientists. And so I looked into this. There is something when you look at it, and it is connected to UFOs. If you read Jacques Vallées' work on UFOs, Jacques Vallée, in his sort of his defining book was called Dimensions, where he kind of, after 30 years of looking at UFOs, or almost 30 years, he said, I think it's interdimensional phenomena.
Yeah, I believe that as well.
And you maybe, for those who want to go on YouTube, a fascinating lecture that Jacques Vallée gives on the future of physics at a TED Talk. Have you heard that one?
No, but I'll definitely look it up.
It's absolutely worth it, because what he says is the missing element of physics and the future of physics is information, right? And of course, he was studying physics. He has a master's in astrophysics, but he left it and he became a computer and information scientist. And he said, look, reality may be more like random access memory, that we may be living inside of a universe that works kind of like a computer, you know. That's, and that goes back to Hermeticism and esotericism, because you go back to Aristotle's metaphysics or Plato's cave, or more recently to Schopenhauer's metaphysics, and they're basically telling you, all of these really smart people, that the physical world is epiphenomenal. The spiritual world is primary. Spirit is primary. Physical being is a derivative creation of mind.
Yeah.
And what that means, that's not as complicated as saying that, we're making up reality in our heads. No, it's not that. I had a conversation with the former lead scientist of the Soviet Star Wars, Soviet attempt to build a directed energy weapon during the Cold War. And he did equations for a whole year, and God spoke to him, said, I will not let you build this weapon. He had a esoteric experience. And he said, those equations told me that the universe is created moment to moment out of the mind of higher intelligences, higher spiritual intelligences. Now, this is getting very close to Hermeticism, because I think the first rule of Hermeticism is that the universe is mental, right? So it's very interesting that physics, and then you get into quantum physics, quantum mechanics, and you get into the same thing. Doesn't mean physical reality isn't real. We're living in it, but it means it's not.
It's a subset of the whole.
It's a subset, exactly. It's a system.
Yeah.
This is the thing that Victor Kulish, the former Soviet scientist, his book is on laser physics. You can get it, Victor Kulish, you can get it on Amazon. And he has a fascinating way of metaphor. He uses the Matryoshka doll, the doll within a doll within a doll.
I used to have them in my house.
Right, to describe what a system is.
Mm-hmm.
And how it works, and he had the math showed that every system is based on a God principle, that there's the biggest Matryoshka doll that all the other ones are inside of. It's fascinating, but
wow.
We're getting way off subject. But yeah, so what are the discoveries? I recommend Annie Jacobson's book Phenomenon, because it's absolutely mind-blowing, the things she's talking about. There's secret levels of things and quantum weapons, and we don't even know fully what those are.
No.
And so we don't know what kind of destructive weapons, whether nuclear weapons even have been superseded. I mean, the United States has seriously neglected its nuclear arsenal. Why?
Yeah.
Is that neglect?
Our
Is
weapons
that
are
stupidity?
ancient. Our launch systems are ancient.
Yep.
The locations have been the same for decades.
Yep.
And I'm sure most of that information, other countries know where all of our weapons are.
Right. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So I don't, I'm of two minds. I've talked to a lot of defense people, and there's a lot of secrecy, and there's also, as you know, corruption in the defense community, and the Russians and Chinese have penetrated a lot of our industry, including defense industry and our government. I mean, you look at Biden and the way that his family's connections to Beijing, the mayor of Moscow, the stuff in Ukraine, what's going on? I mean, are we pretending to be corrupt to fool them, or are we really corrupt and have they penetrated us? It's the wilderness of mirrors, writ large. What is really going on? And it's, I've been following this for more than 30 years, really fascinated by it, and my judge, there's no surety, but my judgment is they've got the upper hand on us right now. But in war, in games of mixed chance and skill, anything can happen, especially when there's so much a fog of war and you just don't know.
Well, beautifully put, Jeff. We've gone 30 minutes, and this has been such an interesting conversation. We've covered so many topics. Do you have any timelines? How do you think it's going to roll out?
It looks like they're moving into Luhansk and Donetsk now. It looks like there's going to be a general invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine's going to be brought back into a new kind of union. You're going to see a larger union forming. They might call it the Soviet Union. They might. And NATO is going to be very alarmed. I think NATO might prove to be a little more resilient than people think. But you could have countries like Hungary and Bulgaria dropping out of NATO. You could have Bulgaria or Serbia even joining this new union. You could have trouble in the Middle East between Israel and Iran, because Iran is very close to develop nuclear weapons. And of course, you've got China that is really building up. And so we could have a larger war developing out of the tit for tat that goes on from here. So I think it gets more dangerous from here on out.
Well, let's keep in touch. And we have another podcast already scheduled. We discussed where we're going to talk a little bit about these war games and how they relate to some of the work we do on our channel with paleoclimatology. And maybe, just maybe, in my opinion, I think the sun is going to have an integral part on stopping all these war games in the near future. And what I mean by that is a Carrington type event, major grid failure, and what will happen is, and we know militaries, especially in the US, we have deep underground bunkers. The DUMs are being built. There is definitely underground hardened infrastructure I'm sure, in the United States military, where we have deep bases that can withstand huge EMPs or CMEs or solar flares. And so the technology will be saved, but humanity on the surface, they're going to be left out in the cold.
It's possible.
Yeah. And let's dive into that in a future podcast. Now, before we go, it's very important that you all check out J.R. Nyquist's blog. And Jeff, can you tell them what? I don't have it up here. What is the website?
JRNYQUIST.blog.
Yeah, perfect.
That's the site, and you could look at my page on Amazon, the J.R. Nyquist page, and there you can order The Fool and His Enemy, which is my latest book. It's a nice little read. In about 3-4 hours, you can read the whole thing. It kind of gives you a very big overview, and it touches on some of these matters. If you're interested in esoterics and abstract philosophy, you might want to read it.
Yeah, here
are
all your
there's
books.
my other books there. Yeah.
Yeah. So, Jeff, pleasure to have you. Pleasure having you on the show. This is going to go up on Rumble tonight, so please check it out. I'll leave you the links below, and it's a pleasure talking to you.
Oh, pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on the Oppenheimer Ranch project.
Yeah, and that's a wrap. Have a great night.
Okay.